Good afternoon, and welcome to this week's episode of Supply Chain Talk. Our main topic today is navigating supply chain tariffs, challenges and opportunities for the industry. Before that, I'll be introducing my guests and also invite you, of course, to join in the chat panel to share your questions, comments, insights, and so on. And we always welcome those. And as always, we will be sharing a Supply Chain Talk mug for the contribution we find most useful. So do keep those comments coming. So let me introduce my three guests today. The first of those is a familiar face on the show, Nanda Kishore, who's Vice President of Sourcing and Supply Chain at Evoy. He's based in Bergen in Norway, and he has international supply chain and sourcing experience of 28 years and leadership experience driving transformation across global manufacturing, marine and clean tech sectors. And he also has much expertise in supplier development, localization and clean tech industrialization. And away from business, as some of you may recall, he's an endurance specialist, endurance enthusiast, and he's climbed mountains including Kilimanjaro, Lobuche, and Mira Peak, which is almost 6,500 meters. And he regularly runs half marathons. So welcome again, Nanda. Our second guest is Srinivas Suresh, who is supply chain lead at Joby Aviation. That's a fascinating company who have developed and manufactured electric short distance aircraft, and he's based in California. Srinivas is a results-driven supply chain leader with extensive experience in scaling innovative technology companies. And currently, he serves as the lead of supply chain and planning at Joby Aviation. And when he's not working, Srinivas parents 5 kids, as he puts it. 3 of those kids are human, which is a lot. And as if that's not enough, he's got 2 dogs as well. And all of those are between the ages of 8 months and 8 years. I won't inquire which species is which ages, but welcome, Srinivas.
Thanks for having me, Alistair.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And finally, Nitin Murali is Vice President for Supply Chain Excellence at Gallo. Gallo, a very familiar brand name in wine, but they also produce many other beverages, as Nitin reminded me. And he is also based in California, and he leads the digital transformation of Gallo's operations with a focus to drive synergies and optimize the integration of cutting-edge tools, processes, technology, and data management across Gallo's entire value chain. And before joining Gallo, he spent 14 years at L'Oreal, where he led transformations in North America and Africa and the Middle East, giving him global experience and perspective to navigate complex supply chain challenges in diverse market conditions. And I guess challenges in diverse market conditions are very much the subject today. But let's first of all, as always, turn to our news item. And our news item this time, we sometimes have it related to the main subject, but actually today it's just such a big topic in itself. We've chosen something entirely different. And the article is entitled "The Amazon Internship Giving Hope to Autistic People Like Us." And it's actually, I'll just hold it up. It's actually a great big piece from the UK newspaper, The Times, and it's from the Saturday magazine of The Times. So very much a kind of real detailed feature. And we felt it was a really interesting article because it starts with the fact that fewer than 5% of adults with a learning disability or autism have a job, so just 5% or less, and yet 80% of those individuals want a job. They want the independence that could come with that. And the article then goes into lots of detail and profiles some of those people you could see briefly in the photo I showed. And it describes what the article refers to as a groundbreaking project transforming lives, which is the intern program at Amazon. And the scheme is not just a scheme to target recruiting, a particular group of individuals. It's a much deeper program than that, where the interns are given a year of training with lessons and support on how to handle the workplace, given the kind of challenges they have. And it goes into a lot of detail about the positives and their own perspective of it and so on. But the upshot is, of course, it results in almost all the young adults who go through that program gaining both skills and permanent jobs at Amazon. And Amazon benefits because those employees become very loyal and dependable. And I think it's also, a great inspiration to their colleagues and teammates in Amazon. So, a really positive story and a very positive aspect of Amazon, which, to be fair, does get quite a lot of negative press for its employment practices. And it struck me as a very great example of how supply chains, with the huge number of warehouse jobs that they create, have a real potential to make a significant impact in a very sort of focused minority group, as in this article. So, Nanda, turning to you, I mean, what are your thoughts on the initiative? And do you think, lots of other large employers in the logistics sector should be following Amazon's example and introducing schemes like this?
I think so. It's quite inspiring. And also, as you said, Alistair, what stood out to me was less than 5% of adults with learning disability are in paid employment. I mean, 80%, despite 80% wanting for work, that's a massive overlooked force.
Yes,
So
yeah.
it's a good initiative, but also we shouldn't forget the fact that it's diversity at its best. But if you read the article, the way they have sort of oriented and introduced the interns into the program, that's with respect, mutual respect. So that's very vital for it. So now it's easy to say, we will hire some interns with the disabilities, but to make them feel comfortable, take them through a process to meet the requirements. That's the key there. And I'm sure this is a good thing. I think most of the companies should at least follow. Instead of just saying we value diversity, they should show this in action like this one.
Yes, that's
Very
that's
good
a
one.
great point you make. That every company always say, "Oh, we value
Yeah.
diversity," but what do they really do about it in terms of going
Yes, this is
a
good.
lot further? Yeah, that's a great point. Srinivas, what did you think about this example?
It's a great initiative. Like in my past, I remember companies like IBM and thinking about supply chain. Walmart
Mm,
does spend a lot of time training employees with disability, bringing them to the regular workforce. And I think, as Nanda said, diversity is at its best. But also feel there could be there's always more that everyone can do. Particularly, thinking about governments, the state, federal agencies that could sponsor some of these programs and make it mandatory for companies of all sizes, of all industries to be more inclusive.
mm.
But yeah, it's a great example of what one large company, with all the negative press, this is something really positive to look forward to and
Yeah.
take away.
Yes, yeah, and it's interesting as you say, what is there a role for government, for regulators to really kind of impose this a little bit more, but meanwhile, yeah, Amazon has shown a great initiative there. And Nitin, your thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's a fantastic initiative for sure. When we talk about agility and resilience in supply chain, we often talk about process and technology quite a lot. We don't talk enough about the human factor,
Mm,
is what I feel. And I think, in my experience at least, what I've felt is that, of course, not just for social impact, but diverse thinking creates operational resilience, when you're dealing with unpredictability everywhere. So I think that's one key aspect that every company, every organization needs to kind of prioritize, not just because of diversity and inclusion programs, right? It's
mm,
it's it's beyond that. There's a need for diverse thinking to solve complex problems, and I think that is the gist of it. And I agree with both Nanda and Srinivas, and in the saying, people want jobs. Less than 5% of people are getting the jobs
mm,
in the autism space, if you will, which is which should give us all pause in terms of the talent that is potentially out there that are
mm.
not tapped, right?
Yeah.
So that, I think that should give us all a pause and kind of get us to revisit and rethink the way we look at our operational workforce, for sure.
Yeah, and it's a great point you make, Nitin, as well. That the individuals being targeted here, they have got a different way of thinking about things and approaching things. So you kind of wonder, you hope that actually, some of these individuals will move in away from the warehouse floor into other roles where they can apply their intelligence and skills like that even more. So it'll be fascinating to see. And I would recommend to all our audience, do look up the article. The Times one is behind a paywall, I think, but you may be able to register and get it for free. But I'm sure you can find the story reported elsewhere, and I'm sure indeed Amazon must report it too. But it's really great, the richness of the main article. So thanks for those comments. So let's now move to our main topic, which is navigating supply chain tariffs, challenges and opportunities for the industry. Now, I wrote a few notes, which are probably already out of date, the way these things go. But the latest, as far as I could see about a day ago, was that the high tariffs being threatened were going to be imposed on countries not reaching deals with the US by actually a deadline of today, I think, was set. So if you haven't got your deal agreed, in theory, you're going to get a massive tariff on August the 1st. Certainly, letters have been sent out to many countries this week telling them their new tariff rates. And the baseline tariff seems to be 10% for most countries, but can rise to 50% or more for some countries, especially when they've got significant trade surpluses. And in terms of how many deals had been struck as of Monday, Tuesday, I think it was just the UK and Vietnam, as far as I could see, have actually got deals in place. So it does leave major economies like the EU, India, Japan, and Canada without any agreements and therefore potentially facing some pretty massive tariffs. So that's the kind of pretty much the latest. I don't think there's been anything else on the news today. The first discussion point we had was how tariffs affect costs, sourcing, logistics, and key industries amid the trade agreements and geopolitical shifts. And I guess some of the examples already out there are that Chinese goods that were once destined for the US until recently are now being redirected to other destinations, especially Europe and emerging markets. So that's kind of already adding, cost pressure, price pressure on perhaps other suppliers into those markets. Some firms are relocating production out of China to Vietnam and India to avoid US tariffs. Apple is one example there, I think. Perhaps turning to you first, Nanda. What are you seeing as the impact, particularly in your sector? Are you seeing a big impact there in terms of, did you used to export to the US? And is that, I mean, again, obviously, of course, don't share anything you don't want to share commercially, but I'm obviously interested to get your perspective on what you're seeing in your industry.
Yeah, we are also affected, but tariffs have been always fundamentally altering the cost equation of global supply chain. But I think now it's more than shifting. It's sort of recalibrating the entire sourcing logic for most of the companies. And sectors where I worked, like aerospace or marine or the current electromobility, there are a lot of items. I'm just going to give a little bit in detail so that people get the perspective. There are a lot of let's say few items which are long lead and they are highly sourcing precision dependent, and and a small change of even 10% tariff can easily wipe off the entire margin structure of the products.
Right.
So the companies can just go like this because there are products which are dependent on markets. Like for us, it was US is a good market. And so in those cases, these current times are quite challenging times. So there are a lot of things in play. And just to add to you, for EU, they've got an extension of deadline for 1st of August. So we are still at 10%.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. No, thank you. I mean, it's really fascinating thinking about your field, and I know Joby Aviation construct their aircraft in the US, but I mean, it is a very specialist market, and you can't just suddenly say to someone, "Hey, we import a particular aircraft part, aviation part from Europe, and oh, we better find someone who can make it in the US." I mean, it's got to be certified and approved and so on. So, kind of, what's your perspective for the aviation sector?
We should work that way, but I think I expect the impact to be non-zero across industries and to varying degree on strategies employed by some of these companies. Speaking of strategy, at Joby, we are industry leading in terms of vertical integration. What this basically means is that we have to source thousands of diversified SKUs, components that allow us maximum flexibility, control, and also diversification of supply chain at the very beginning. Obviously, it's easier said than done, but that's the undertaking that we have done. And also the value addition that happens in Joby is to the maximum extent on these components that we source downstream. So thus minimizing the tariff impact, if not the lowest, but at the end of the day, I expect this to be non-zero. But there's always, an expected amount of groundwork that needs to be done when you're trying to plan for these tariffs.
Yeah.
And at the Joby specifically, the vertical integration piece plays a key role in keeping tariffs at bay. And
Right.
obviously, time will tell. The 10%, if it moves to 100%, the impacts will be different. But there is some cushion that allows us with this practice.
Okay, so what you're saying really is that because you're only importing kind of quite low-level components and then you're adding all the value in the US in your manufacturing, actually, if that content goes up by 10% for the small proportion of components that you actually import, yeah, compared to the total value of the aircraft, it's not going to be very big, even if you have to
That's
absorb
right.
that. Yeah, okay.
That is correct. Yep. And that is played, that's playing to our strengths. I mean, we've been doing this for probably about more than a decade. And this is truly playing to our strengths compared to our competition in the industry, and also typically thinking about aerospace.
Mm.
But also brings a level of difficulties across, because now you have to go and find the suppliers and diversify your supply chain. It's not an easy task.
No, no, absolutely. And Nitin, turning to you, I guess, Gallo, well known for its wines, produced in California, so no problem there. But I guess you also import wines from all around the world, don't you? I think in South America quite a lot, and as well as many other
Yeah.
beverages, and of course you're exporting. So I guess
Yeah.
you're worried about retaliatory tariffs as well. So what are your perspectives in the beverage sector?
Yeah, I agree with Srinivas. It is a non-zero game. We're also quite vertically integrated. So Gallo, I don't know if everyone knows, we make our own glass bottles.
Right. Okay.
So,
Yeah.
like, so that kind of positions us slightly differently. I think what is interesting with the tariffs this time is the consumer sentiment, especially from countries like Canada, that has impacted the industry quite a lot, right? Because with people only buying locally made alcohol beverage, etc. It's impacted the US industry overall in the alcohol beverage space. And there are some nuances in the alcohol beverage space which is quite interesting. So for example, if I'm making a Prosecco in Italy that I'm importing in, I cannot just nearshore the assembly of it and call it a Prosecco, because the Prosecco needs to be filled in Italy. So
Yeah.
there are complexities like that we need to navigate. But overall, I think what we are seeing is, with scale and vertical integration, there are opportunities for us to kind of claw back some of the things that are lost with things like drawbacks, etc. Focusing more on the export side. So that's one lever that we are definitely focusing on. Overall, I think it's an interesting kind of a space right now, because again, as you mentioned, retaliatory tariffs. I don't know if people will say bourbons from the US is now going to be hit with the 35% tariffs. I don't know, but
Yeah.
I think, based on the way we are set up, we are positioned much better than a lot of others to kind of deal with that, I think.
Yes, yeah, but it's an interesting point you make. I mean, it is, I think, a common to all industries, but a very specific example with Prosecco there that you can't, you got to import Prosecco from Italy, otherwise it's not Prosecco, and
Exactly.
either you stop selling Prosecco, or you take the hit of the duty yourself, or you put the price up for the consumer, which none of those is necessarily that attractive. It's
Yeah, but that's where I think you need to look at total landed cost, right? So if
mm,
you may have a Prosecco that you don't want to pass that price on to the consumers, but at the same time, you probably have other products in your portfolio that can kind of make up for that tariff from a drawback perspective. So it's
mm.
it's not a it's not a brand, it's not a product specific game either. And that's where organizations and companies that have a bigger SKU portfolio actually stands a better chance, I feel.
Yeah, yeah,
And,
okay,
and just to add on to that, I think it's
yeah,
also important to keep in mind in some of this tariff discussion, the news cycle that's been happening. uh, it's important not to panic. A lot of this requires long-term planning. There's really not much that you can do today, but there's a lot of
mm,
things that you would have to plan for next couple of months, next couple of years. And I think some of these younger companies, growing companies, tend to panic a lot and
mm.
make quick decisions that are not necessarily helpful in the long term. So
Yeah.
that's something that I feel like it's important while you're mitigating tariffs and understanding the exposure to it. It's also making sure you're not taking or making decisions in haste.
Yes, and which is why it's actually quite surprising how some companies have already, announced big changes in production. Whether it's Apple moving it from China to India, whether it's companies announcing investments in factories, and absolutely, as you say, unless that decision was literally about to be taken anyway, you're thinking you surely didn't make that decision literally in the space of a few months to make such a commitment.
Yeah.
Uh, and I guess it all just relates to the fact that this isn't a sort of kind of a long or medium term guidance to say, okay, in these sectors, we recognize it takes you 2 years to set up a factory, so we're giving you 2 years, and if you haven't, started work in a year, we're going to apply the tariff anyway because we can see you're not going to do it. There's just it's just crazy, isn't it, the way some of these tariffs are coming in so quickly.
And I think you mentioned of Apple. I mean, there's this again amazing example of long-term planning. Like Apple switching, diversifying outside of China has been happening for probably the last 10 years.
Right.
New cycles of building phones in India, outside of China, Vietnam, and obviously in the last 6 months they've announced another establishment of factory in US. So it clearly tells that it requires long-term planning, and obviously having those options at bay helps you quickly mitigate risk, right? In
Mm.
Apple's case, it's like, sure, we'll make phones in India. If if there is tariffs levied on India, then they probably move to Vietnam, and so on.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's what the biggest learning for all of us is it's massive long-term planning.
Yes, yeah. And even there, it's kind of you can kind of have the capacity sort of plan, but to shift production of tens of millions of phones, kind
Not
of
easy.
you need a lot of people to be recruited and a lot of people to be ramped up and trained up. But let's move
Yeah,
to our
and
second discussion point, which is mitigating tariff risks with supplier diversification, which we've touched on a little bit, nearshoring and automation, and by leveraging exemptions or trade programs. And yeah, we've already talked about the way that production has shifted from China to India in some cases, and we're seeing some examples of reshoring. But the talk of nearshoring as a mitigating sort of strategy is kind of with the tariffs announced with Mexico and Canada. That's sort of what always used to be seen as a good compromise, part of the North American free trade agreement. Suddenly, that's not even a compromise anymore. So turning back to you, Nanda, what do you think are the most effective ways to mitigate tariff risks? Obviously, there are lots of choices, but what do you think is the answer here?
It's quite complex, and when you say a lot of choices, I would say yes and no, because there are two very distinct scenarios when we face such kind of tariffs. One scenario where you have a company producing the product, like let's take the example of US. So you're producing product in US and you are importing some components, and then a tariff of 10% is not a big deal. But you see the other side of the fence where you're supplying a product to US, the product which had a 1% tariff, $100,000 product, then you would have paid $1,000 versus
Mm.
suddenly 10% tariff, which is $10,000 per unit you export to US. And
Mm.
in sectors like aerospace and marine and electromobility, you are usually having a long-term price agreements. So you're
Right.
bound to supply at a price, and suddenly you have to supply the product, and every unit is costing you $10,000 more, which you can't
Mm.
get it back from the customer. Then it's
And,
a
and in your
complicated.
experience then, Nanda, in your experience, I mean, because I know that quite often, customer agreements, your agreement to sell to a customer would have a sort of clauses to say if duties, tariffs, shipping rates
No.
change dramatically, you find
No,
you can't impose
it's
those.
there. It's a question of interpretation, because you're talking
Mm.
about regulatory and unrealistic regulatory or restrictions. So
Mm.
usually the clauses are centered around force majeure or delays and some
Mm.
kind of a tier 3 supplier going bankrupt. So
Mm.
most of the product of this kind of nature are bound by a penalty for delays. So
Right.
you try to cover up, nobody anticipates that you suddenly have to pay 10% more for every unit. Imagine you have to supply 100 units in next 3 months. and at 10% of 100 units, it's a massive cost. So mitigating tariff, I would say nearshoring, reshoring, or onshoring, it's not just about that. In the mid to long term, I would say it's building what I would call as a tariff tolerant ecosystem.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's about flexible supplier networks, agility in design, end-to-end visibility on compliance and trade, global trades. But at the key two actions, I would say, which is very vital, is multi-country sourcing as a strategy or a practice, not when we have to suddenly source. And then most of the companies probably have now begun to realize something called as tariff engineering. If you go to tariff, it's not just as simple as, okay, this is a product. So there are a lot of HS codes. So each of the tariffs are calculated against HS code. And HS code can be altered based on the configuration of the component. So you remove two components, HS code becomes something else. So you need to really work out on those. So it's a big paradigm shift, I would say, for the design engineers who are just picking up what they see from the internet or from some company product catalogs. So this will be a challenge for many engineering and manufacturing companies. The design department will be under a lot of pressure to redesign things.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, and I guess the risk there is that if there's too much of that, then the US might say, no, you're not allowed to do that. These codes are suddenly going to get the bigger tariff anyway because everyone's using
so
a
particular.
So
it's a panic situation plus also long-term planning. So the key message is you have to always plan. You can't start planning when we are in a crisis. So planning should be part of your day-to-day job.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And turning to you, Srinivas, I mean, again, what are your thoughts on mitigating the tariff risks? And I'm particularly struck by I think, Nanda, you mentioned, I think in your first reply, that because a lot of the contracts in place between supplier and customer mean the supplier is committed to a price, a landed price, so they're going to have to take the hit of the tariff. And I think you said, Nanda, it can just drive a company out of business altogether. And if your supplier goes bust, well, no one's going to be happy then. So anyway, so that's just a reminder of the risks there. So so over to you, Srinivas. What are your thoughts on how best to mitigate tariff risks?
I think that's a good point, but remember, it's not holding suppliers accountable to the price that they committed in the contract or an agreement, but it really comes down to striking that mutually beneficial partnership that's going to allow the supplier to go. The last thing that you want is to drive your supplier bankrupt, because then you're going to struggle finding the next best supplier to take their place. But thinking about tariffs like 10 years ago, this was the last thing anyone would have thought about. Let's plan a supply chain for tariff. Right now, building resilience and immunity to tariff is really challenging because you have variables that are constantly moving. The way I think about this is, you pick your battles, right? You have a list of components that you want to manage. You think about from commodity perspective. You're buying glass, plastics, metal, right? You think about the unique value add a vendor or a supplier brings into game that you can't find anywhere else. And the last thing is the most critical supply chain that is existential for your company. Those are the areas where you would focus and break them out and figure out how you want to engineer your supply chain. As Nanda said, I think tariff engineering, take it even more further and understand each of your supply chain nodes and how you can minimize risk by diversification. You're buying material from X place, you're processing in Y, and you're adding additional value at Z. That allows you to flex as and when times change, how you want to move around your cost basis, right? And that will allow you to keep the cost in check, like minimizing the total landed cost at all times. And that's the best way to think about this for any company who starts, who's starting to plan around tariff. But the bigger piece of this is, as I've said, long-term planning is the massive key. Companies who have taken the risk, think about this as hedging your supply chain, right? Who would have thought Apple building multi-billion-dollar facilities partnership in India and Vietnam would have paid off right now? It's paying off big time. I mean, off the bat, they're saving 50 or 60% on tariffs by not building in China, right? So it's about taking those bets carefully. Calculated risk is super important to be successful. It may pay off, it may not, but it's the cost of doing business in this age.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, no, thank you. And just before turning to Unitin, I mean, lots of comments in appearing here. I think Umul raises Umul Desai, I don't know if I pronounced it correctly, raises the interesting thing about, you know, your tier one versus tier three, and I suppose there. As we're recognizing, you know, a tier three supplier may just suddenly say, "Forget it, you know, I'm not gonna supply the US anymore," or unfortunately, I've gone bust because that's my main market, and you know, it can be difficult for companies, you know, for organizations to identify what's going on. You know, tier one, of course, tier two, probably you know what's going on. As soon as you get to tier three, you know, how easy is it to monitor that? So just sharing that thought. So Nitin, I don't know if that's one you want to comment on, or the main question there about how do you mitigate tariff risks?
I want to echo what Srinivas said. I think resilience is not a short-term strategy, right? So resilience is a longer-term play, and we need to, companies just cannot build resilience in 90 days. You have to plan for it, you have to build for it, you have to have a long-term strategy around it. So that's number one. I think, you know, from a short-term mitigation perspective, there are some levers that, you know, organizations can look at. It includes, you know, as Nanda mentioned, the HS code optimization. Like, there's 40,000 plus HS codes that are out there. You know, and a lot of companies don't review these HS codes at all. So there are
Yeah.
probably some quick wins there in terms of, hey, you know, what you have classified as if there's a slight tweak to it and it gets classified as B, now you don't have to pay as much of tariffs, right? So that's one aspect. I don't think a lot of organizations are looking at it from that perspective. The second thing is, you know, for me, foreign trade zone, you know, usage, right? So how many companies are actually using trades for, you know, free trade zones, which then means that you can delay the duty, you know, payment up to 5 years. So our is thinking about this from that perspective. Yeah, and I think, you know, duty drawback is something that we've already discussed and talked about. Small businesses, I feel, and you know, this kind of bridges to the question on the comments. Small businesses, whether it's like tier three suppliers, whatever, they get hit the worst. And I think, you know, when you think about it, it's because they have limited buying power and influence. But now, you know, think about, I don't know, 50 small businesses coming together and investing into a free trade zone to be used collectively between them. That could be an answer. I don't know if that'll work, but that could be an answer, is what I'm saying. So I think, you know, going back to what Nanda and Srinivas said, the answer is in collective infrastructure, collective intelligence, and kind of trying to solve this problem together. You know, if there's two companies here in the United States, like one in Ohio and another one in Alabama, and they're individually trying to solve this, but if they come together, it's probably easier to find some solutions. That's the thing that I think, you know, in the competitive landscape, we don't often realize that there's some common ground here for us to kind of play into. And we all try to solve these problems by ourselves. So I think that's one of the things that I've seen.
That's a great piece of advice there, Nitin. Thank you. And I have to say, I think that the risk of the US Department of Trade spotting who's misusing a product category code is probably small, because given the famous list of tariffs, it included some uninhabited island in the middle of the Pacific, which was told what its tariffs were going to be, and no one lives there except some penguins. So I think I don't think they'll be onto everything.
Yeah, at the same time, the classification itself could be incorrect, right?
Yeah.
So you know, the company may have actually, you know, changed the material that they're using, and they forgot to update the HS code.
Yeah.
And that happens quite a lot as well. And we're talking about leaving money on the table. You know,
Yeah.
so
Some
it's
great
important
advice
that people.
There's also increased scrutiny. I mean, if you look at the fine print of how, you know, the tariffs are applied and targeted, it looks at value add coming from a specific you know, country or place, and further, you know, deep diving into the supply chain of where you're getting rest of the components from. I was just looking at this like maybe last couple of months, but as Nitin pointed out, I think one of the key things is actually understanding your supply base all the way to, you know, tier, you know, X,
Yes.
working with them to identify how they can diversify the supply chain, because diversifying their supply chain in turn helps the subsequent value stream in every supply chain of a component. And I think that's very, very underplayed today. There's a lot of opportunity to find your tier fours, tier threes, tier twos, and have this conversation. How can we help? What is it that you need to do to be able to be more resilient to the tariff impacts? And
Yeah.
that's the conversation we are actively having, and that's yielded in a lot of good conversation, things that
Yeah.
benefit not only us but their customer base as well.
Yeah.
So striking that partnership is more important than treating them as a supplier, as a tier three or a tier four supplier.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I love the way that we're sort of getting out of here. There is a silver lining to the cloud of tariffs if it makes organizations suddenly understand that some of their product codings and category codes are miscategorized, that they're not working enough with their tier 4, 5 suppliers, and so on. I guess the challenge is getting the resource for all the analysis and data and discussions that are needed. But it's great that there are actually some positives out of this. But let's move to our, because the time's whizzed by, hasn't it? Let's move to our final discussion point, which actually we've touched on a little bit, is where's all this heading in the slightly longer term? So what is the future of tariffs? Is ESG influence something to consider as well, and how businesses can stay agile in evolving regulations? So there's been so much change, as we recognize, in the tariff rates and the timing, even in the last few months since they were first announced. So it's very hard to predict the future. But Nanda, thinking in 3 to 5 years' time, do you think there will ultimately, I mean, which is I think is the aim of all this, is do you think there will be a significant shift of more manufacturing moving back to the US? And do you think other factors like political risk and ESG will also play a part in that? So back to you, Nanda.
Oh, that's a long question.
It is. Sorry. Answer which bits you want to.
Yeah. No, but I don't think anybody can confidently predict where tariffs will go. What we can say is volatility is the baseline. Companies should not be building agility for one country, rather for many. To the point of it's not about, the future is not about bringing everything back home. I think it's about building value chain resilience, including ethical sourcing, lower emission, compliance to global ESG, etc. And if you ask about 3 to 5 years, I would say we'll be looking more and more about onto hybrid modular or modular footprint. I would say modular footprint in supply chain will be the new norm. So by default, each product will have multi-sourcing capabilities, and the modular is what we talked about, tariff engineering. So you should be able to scale up and scale down the components from a different design perspectives. I think that's going to happen. But these kind of wars, these will have a short-term negative effect. But then things could go back, or things could be sort of readjusted along because the demand also is growing. So when the demand grows, then it has an impact on the cost.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
it will sort of balance itself.
Yeah, and I like the way that we had to think about the full extended supply chain, including design and what is assembled, manufactured at which points in a product's life. So yeah, interesting thinking about that perspective. Srinivas, kind of your thoughts on the 3 to 5 year horizon?
I think one thing what this is going to yield into every company, every industry building a very flexible supply chain. That's what it's going to ultimately yield into. US manufacturing will be part of that flexible supply chain. The question is based on circumstances, like how the tariff climate is. It will allow companies to flex capacity or their the supply chain as and when needed. They want to get maximum sourcing done out of the US. They have the ability to do that. If they want to offshore it, that's an option too. But I think that's what it really comes down to, is building flexibility, and companies have started to do it, so they can fine tune that and adapt as and when the environment changes. Speaking of ESG, I think I'm yet to see a very typical impact of the tariff, at least right now. But if you think about more mature countries where, say, automotive or EV, etc., um,
Mm.
the companies in certain countries have very mature ESG practices. Um, Obviously, with the immediate tariff impact, you can't utilize, and it's not going to help you from a cost perspective to go after the supply chain. But also, what it deals into is, taking those practices and building out in new countries and new companies is one of the other ways of thinking how this can possibly help expand the ESG initiative throughout the globe. But yeah, I think it goes both ways at this point with tariff.
Okay, no, thank you. And Nitin, finally, your thoughts on the future 3 to 5 years out.
I think we'll see the emergence of supply chain ecosystems more and more, right? So managed supply chain ecosystems more and more. I mean, I was reading somewhere that, we are not in the VUCA world anymore, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. We're in the BANI world, which is a new acronym that is going around, which is brittle, anxious, I don't know, neurotic, whatever. So anyway, it's completely incomprehensible in terms of what could happen within our overall ecosystem. So I think more collaboration, more cooperation to kind of build network resilience is going to come, out more and more. In fact, I was reading an article on Gartner the other day that said, supply chain orchestration is the new thing, right? So orchestrating what? Orchestrating the ecosystem. So I think the ecosystem orchestration, ecosystem management is where we are going to move. And if that's the case, the network itself becomes the competitive advantage, right? So when tariff conditions change, managed ecosystems can really reconfigure faster than individual companies can rebuild supply chains. So that's the fundamental aspect of it. And when you think of ESG and things like that, I've always felt that you have to have an ecosystem-wide kind of a program to really make a difference. If not, you're really just taking bits and pieces of it and trying to hit a particular KPI on your dashboard. You're not truly making a huge difference, right? So I think if I've always felt that individual companies cannot do this alone. You have to have some level of network coordination to kind of get this done. So my hope is, we will actually find more co-opetition where companies that are competitors coming together to solve some common problems without really sacrificing their competitive edge, if you will.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's a level of collaboration we need to kind of solve some of these big problems that are coming up, I think.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think it's a great way of sort of wrapping up that it does remind us that a lot of the concepts that have been talked about for a long time in supply chain excellence, supply chain best practice of kind of the holistic view, the whole ecosystem, and indeed bringing ESG into it all. These are all coming to the fore. And I guess the challenge is, are there enough excellent people like yourselves to make all these things happen and to lead that analysis and transformation? So, which is something I'm sure we'll be talking about in other episodes. No, thank you very much for those, and not least, of course, some fantastic points that you shared, some really practical pieces of advice of some specific things to look at. Thank you for our audience who have shared some great insights, loads, and I couldn't keep up with all the comments. I know Ashley Cook is a regular contributor. Thank you, Ashley. But you have got a cupboard full of Supply Chain Talk mugs. So I'm going to say, Ermal Desai, nice to hear from you. And a Supply Chain Talk mug will be on its way to you. Our next episode is this time next week, 4 p.m. UK time on July the 16th, hosted by Anna Maria Velika. And she is going to be discussing with her guests rewriting the rules, how agile supply chains are winning in an age of disruption. And I guess we've introduced some of the concepts there already. So thank you once again to my three excellent guests, Nanda Kishore of Evoy, Srinivas Suresh from Joby Aviation, and Nitin Murali from Gallo. Thanks all three of you for some fantastic contributions. Thank you for our audience for some great contributions as well. And do join us this time next week. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Very much.
Thank you, Alistair.